The new Fear Street trilogy, which brings R.L. Stine's chilling teen novels to the screen for the first time, is a thrilling tribute to slasher films. So in the spirit of the Fear Street trilogy's unique celebration of slasher cinema, here's a look at how this genre has evolved over time. It's not easy to pin down which film qualifies as the very first slasher pick, but Germany's Krimi films and Italy's Giallo picks are some of the earliest examples of cinema that paired crime stories with the bloodshed that became a slasher genre staple. Many of the Krimi films, short for criminal film or crime film of the late 50s and 60s, are based on the works of British novelist Edgar Wallace, and like modern slasher films, often focused on elusive masked villains. In fact, in these films, the bad guys are so important that they often appear in the movie's titles, as with 1959's Face of the Frog and 1967's Creature with a Blue Hand. In addition, these movies also tend to feature stock casts that parallel those of slashers. There's usually a female protagonist, a comedic relief character, a police officer who's central to the case, and a group of victims who get picked off one by one. Though the Krimi movies weren't beholden to a specific genre, they were highly influential in the development of the slasher. The Italian Giallo films of the 60s and 70s, for example, were directly influenced by the Krimi picks. In fact, some of these movies are actually partly German productions, like 1972's What Have You Done to Solange? Like the Krimi pictures, Giallo films often focus on a murder investigation featuring a masked killer, but they ratchet the gore and sensuality up significantly, creating a distinct new vein of horror film. Mario Bava's films in particular are essential Giallo fare, along with those of Dario Argento, who earned the nickname Master of the Thrill with gory films like Deep Red and Opera, which is considered one of the best slasher movies ever made. With gorgeous cinematography and a plot thick with mystery, blood, and unnerving imagery, Opera captured everything that makes slasher films so appealing. In the US, Hollywood's horror history began all the way back in the late 19th century with the 3-minute silent film The House of the Devil. Horror has been a popular genre ever since, and throughout the early 20th century, many classics emerged, most of which focused on a classic monster or some sort of supernatural scare. The year 1960 in particular is often pointed to as a real starting point of the modern-day slasher, thanks to the premiere of both Michael Powell's Peeping Tom and Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. Both of these films centered on male murderers, Norman Bates and Mark Lewis, whose psychopathic tendencies stem from their relationships with their parents, and who take their worst impulses out on unsuspecting women. While Psycho is especially famous for its unforgettable shower sequence, the focus on the voyeuristic nature of the villain in Peeping Tom is equally as unsettling. Although both films are also categorized as psychological thrillers, they helped establish the concept of a murderous villain as a central character. No longer did killers need to be mythical creatures or barely seen mystery men. After Norman and Mark, films were officially free to let their villains, and their weapons of choice, take center stage. Between these movies and the growing popularity of gruesome giallo films overseas, slasher films as we know them were on the rise by the early 70s. For many horror fans, the 1970s marked the true start of the slasher subgenre. Movies in this era were clearly influenced by the style and the story structure seen in the classic Krimi films and Giallo films. And the way that Psycho and Peeping Tom put a lens on their villains is clearly seen in the horror films that followed. In fact, one of the things that made the 70s such a significant decade for slashers is how films of that time period introduced so many lasting horror villains. The decade also saw its slasher picks establishing new norms for the genre, including the rise of holiday horror. Both 1972's Silent Night, Bloody Night and 1974's Black Christmas are early examples of horror films that turned holiday celebrations into bloodbaths. Black Christmas proved to be particularly influential. It's based on a long-standing urban legend, showing the plight of college co-eds who are stalked by a killer who makes phone calls from inside their sorority house. That basic concept was also used in the 1979 mystery thriller When a Stranger Calls. But because of the sheer volume of its viciousness, Black Christmas is the movie that's widely regarded as one of the first true slasher picks. The same year that Black Christmas was released, Tobe Hooper's classic The Texas Chainsaw Massacre came along and redefined fright films forever. The film's villain Leatherface was merciless and relentless, and Texas Chainsaw was also one of the first films to use the final girl trope, in which a young girl emerges as the serial killer's sole survivor. Black Christmas also directly inspired another one of the most significant slashers of all time, John Carpenter's 1978 classic Halloween. But even though Halloween is a descendant of Black Christmas, Carpenter's film still stands on its own, coupling the trend of a holiday gone wrong with a masked killer in the vein of Leatherface. The film introduced audiences to its tireless killer Michael Myers, who terrorizes babysitters with his kitchen knife in the small town of Haddonfield, Illinois.
Okay, Linda. Come on out.
Like Leatherface before him, Michael Myers is ruthless and determined, and very hard to kill. And he served as a second in a succession of new masked murderers who spawned decades-long horror film franchises. After the 70s brought slashers into the mainstream, the 80s and early 90s became a heyday for the horror subgenre, with names like Leatherface and Michael Myers inspiring true terror throughout the film-watching world. The era of creative villains taking center stage was at a peak, and soon several other vicious baddies began haunting everyone's nightmares. In 1980, producer Sean S. Cunningham took note of the success of Halloween and offered up his own killer concept with Friday the 13th. Like Halloween, Friday the 13th is about a group of teens terrorized by a mysterious killer, and it marked the start of a full-on franchise centered around its masked maniac Jason Voorhees. Both Halloween and Friday the 13th spawned a series of sequels that came out in quick succession, making both franchises box office mainstays. The Friday the 13th and Halloween films also brought giallo-like sexiness to slashers, and helped establish slasher films' twisted moral codes, in which promiscuous characters are those most likely to be targeted by the villain. Soon after, writer-director Wes Craven earned the nickname Master of Horror with the release of 1984's A Nightmare on Elm Street and its instantly iconic villain Freddy Krueger. Far from the silent, shadowy villains of Friday the 13th and Halloween, Krueger had a sense of humor and loved to taunt his victims. And yet, Freddy is just as scary as the rest of them. In fact, the very concept of Nightmare on Elm Street widened the playing field in ways that literally gave audiences nightmares. While Leatherface was confined to his remote Texas town, Michael Myers tended to lurk near his sister, and Jason Voorhees usually waited for his unfortunate marks to head to Camp Crystal Lake. Freddy stalked his victims in the dream world, giving him unlimited access to his targets. After all, they couldn't avoid sleep forever. The concept of a playful but terrifying killer like Freddy Krueger gave rise to other villains with cheeky personas, like the psychotic doll Chucky from 1988's Child's Play. A Nightmare on Elm Street also made Wes Craven's reputation as a slasher maestro, opening the door for the writer-director to kick off a new horror subgenre about a decade later. After 1987's A Nightmare on Elm Street 3: Dream Warriors, Wes Craven temporarily stepped away from the franchise. When Craven did return to Nightmareland, he was equipped with a very different vision. In 1994's Wes Craven's New Nightmare, A Nightmare on Elm Street actress Heather Langenkamp plays a fictional version of herself who's tormented by a supernatural version of Freddy Krueger.
I thought you killed Freddy off.
Well, we did, but the fans, God bless them, they're clamoring for more.
For help, she has to turn to Craven himself, as well as actor Robert Englund, who portrayed Freddy in the prior films. This novel narrative marked the start of a self-aware era of slashers that Craven himself continued with his 1996 hit Scream. Scream breathed new life into the slasher genre and brought a new generation of horror fans into the fold by embracing and consciously subverting slasher movie tropes. Throughout the movie and its many sequels, Craven layers a running commentary about the so-called rules of slasher flicks, like the sex equals death trope and the never assume the killer is dead jump scare tactic on top of the action itself. The victims in Scream have seen slasher movies before and react accordingly, while the villains are horror film buffs who are trying to subvert the genre's built-in expectations.
Nightmare on Elm Street.
Is that the one where the guy had knives for fingers?
Yeah, Freddy Krueger.
Freddy, that's right. I like that movie. It was scary.
Thanks to Scream, teen slashers were suddenly all the rage again. 1997's I Know What You Did Last Summer, which was written by Scream scribe Kevin Williamson and inspired by 80s slashers like Prom Night and The House on Sorority Row, was a slumber party favorite that played with horror tropes. The 1998 pick Urban Legend was another movie that was in on its own joke, modeling its series of scares after urban legends of old. Nowadays, the slasher subgenre has become a bit more flexible. A few recent slasher movies defy the tradition of a single blade-wielding baddie, and many incorporate tropes from other subgenres, often with great success. 2008's The Strangers, for example, is a tense home invasion story that also recalls vintage slasher films like Black Christmas and Halloween. The same can be said for the 2016 pick Hush, which takes the concept of a woman being terrorized by a masked killer in her home and gives it an exhilarating new twist. Other brilliant recent slashers that play with a classic structure include 2014's The Guest, 2011's You're Next, and 2016's Terrifier. There's even been a second wave of self-referential and sometimes straight-out comedic slasher films, including Happy Death Day, Freaky, and The Babysitter, all of which infuse some levity into a familiar story structure.
So, you want a head start? Come on, you're to the quarterback. Life's not fair, dude.
You guys suck.
You just blew up Sonya.
The new Fear Street films follow in this newfound tradition. They're completely terrifying and filled with vicious killers, but they also add some humorous commentary about the slasher subgenre. As the thrills continue with the second and third installments of Fear Street, the trilogy ratchets up the scares and surprises even further, while also honoring slasher history in its own unique way. Thanks for watching. Click the links in our video to watch more from Netflix Film Club. Subscribe to our YouTube channel to get the latest exclusive videos. Plus, hit the bell so you don't miss a single one.